All right, this is problem 7.4 from Brigham and Houston's Fundamentals of Financial Management, concise 9th edition. This problem introduces the idea of yield to call along with yield to maturity. Now, when we're calculating yield to maturity on a bond, we're assuming a lot of things. First, that it's going to pay exactly as it agreed to. That means that if it said it's going to pay a semi-annual coupon every year over the next 8 years, then it will indeed pay it. That assumes they're not going to go broke or default on the bond. Now, the call provision on a bond allows the corporation to buy back the bond, which they could do at any time. All right, they can buy them back at market price anytime. But these bonds are selling for $12.8309 out in the open market. Now, since interest rates and price move inversely, what happened is this bond was issued at a fairly high interest rate, and interest rates have fallen. If interest rates fall, the price of the bond shoots up. So if this corporation could refinance its bonds, just like refinancing a mortgage, they can lock in a lower rate, except that it would have to buy back each of the bonds that it already has out, and right now they're selling for almost $1,300. Now, what the yield to call allows the corporation to do is buy back the bonds at less than what you might call a fair market value. All right, so now the price of the bond already reflects this. So when we are trying to evaluate callable bonds, what we do is calculate both. Calculate the yield to maturity, and that assumes that the bond's going to pay exactly as promised, and we do yield to call on the assumption that the first chance that they get, the corporation is actually going to call the bonds. For yield to maturity, they have 8 years left, and they're paying twice a year, so that'd be 16 total payments. The par value is $1,000. They pay 11% of $1,000. That's $110 a year, except they pay it in 2 installments of $55 each. Okay? The current price is $1,283.09. So if we were to calculate the yield here, the rate that we calculate will be the semi-annual rate, so I'm going to have to reconvert this into the annualized number. Okay, so that's the rate every 6 months. So the annual would be simply take that number times 2. And so the yield to maturity on this bond is about 6.42%. Now, with yield to call, what we do is instead of assuming that it goes to maturity, we assume it gets called the first chance they get. Now, the par value or the payments aren't going to change. The call premium, though, if they call the bond in 4 years, they'll actually have to pay $11.54 instead of $1,000. That's where it says callable in 4 years at $11.54. The extra $1,054 is called a call premium. All right, the price is still the price. Instead of having 8 years to go, though, if they can call it 4 years from now, we assume the first chance they get, they'll call it, and they can buy back the bond and end up paying less than 6.42%. They'd only be paying 6.32% over the next 4 years. The assumption, when we calculate the yield to call on a callable bond, compare the yield to maturity and yield to call, the assumption is that the bond would call here because it would save the corporation money. If they can call it, they'll end up paying 6.32% effective rate between now and 4 years from now. which is lower. So if they can get a cheaper interest rate, they probably will. The assumption when we talk about what return should investors expect to earn on these bonds, you'd expect to earn the lower of the yield to call or the yield to maturity, because it's assumed these bonds would call.